Welcome to the Sonogenetics podcast. I'm Patrick Short. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Sonogenetics, and we're here in Cambridge with a really excellent guest, someone I've been looking forward to talking to for a while, and that's Nick Sireau. Nick has had a very incredible career. He originally studied business and journalism, but when his sons were diagnosed with a rare disease called Alkaptonuria, AKU, or the black bone disease, he decided to quit his job and dedicated himself to finding a cure. So Nick, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really excited to tell your story to a wider audience. So would you mind just taking us back to the beginning, how you found out about your first son's diagnosis, and then what led you to decide to quit your job and dedicate your life to this?
Sure. So it all started for me in October 2000 when our first son Julian was born, and we brought him back from the clinic, and it was a Sunday, and we were changing his nappies and we noticed that they'd gone red-black. So we called an emergency doctor who came along and tested for blood and couldn't find any. So he scratched his head and looked around and asked us what had we been eating that day, and it so happened we'd had some red cabbage. So he said it was the dye from the red cabbage entering the breast milk, then entering the baby, and then coming out in the urine. So we really didn't believe that was possible. So next day, on the Monday, we went to see our GP, and he took it very seriously, and he sent off for a whole bunch of tests at Great Ormond Street, and after a few weeks it came back with this diagnosis of Alkaptonuria, or AKU as we call it, and it was a disease that we'd never heard about. I mean, it's ultra rare. It affects about one person in maybe 500,000, or maybe one person in 250,000, so really on the ultra rare side of the spectrum. And the first thing he said is, whatever you do, don't go back and search for it on the internet.
Right.
Which is exactly what we did.
Of course.
And we were very alarmed by what we came across. We came across, there was a Yahoo group of patients, and they were just kind of exchanging stories about their joint replacements and the pain they were going through and having to become jobless, and what kind of pain relief they were using, and the effect on the mood and everything. So it was pretty shocking. And then what happened is we went to see a specialist at Great Ormond Street, and he said, look, there's nothing you can do. When they're children, they'll be okay. The pain will start in adulthood, and that's when the joints will start to deteriorate, but there really is nothing you can do. And through my internet searches, I had met a patient called Robert Gregory who lived in Liverpool. And Robert had just set up the AKU Society with a doctor called Dr. Ranganath, who is a metabolic consultant at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital. And so I joined them, and we set up the AKU Society. And then my second child, in 2003, Daniel, was diagnosed. And that's when I really kind of realised I need to do something about this. Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit more about AKU? So my understanding is it's a recessive disorder. Just in case people don't know what that is, would you mind explaining that, and maybe how it was explained to you when it was first diagnosed?
So AKU is a monogenic disorder, and by that it means that it's a single gene. So we have thousands, tens of thousands of genes, and it's a single one which has a mutation. And in the case of my children, it's a gene called the HGD gene, which codes for an enzyme or a protein called homogentisate 1,2 dioxygenase. And that enzyme...
Can you spell that?
Yeah. And that enzyme breaks down a substance called homogentisic acid. So because of their mutation, the enzyme either doesn't form properly or doesn't form at all, so they can't break down this homogentisic acid. And that accumulates in the body at 2,000 times the normal rate. Now, most of it gets excreted in the urine, which is why the urine goes red-black, because the homogentisic acid goes red-black in contact with air. But a certain amount stays in the body, and it tends to really attach to cartilage and bone, and it then goes black. And that process is called ochronosis. And as life develops, it damages the cartilage and bone more and more, and eventually the cartilage becomes 4 times tougher than plastic. So it loses all its kind of suppleness and everything, which means that it starts to become brittle and bits start to break away, and eventually patients have bone rubbing against bone. So one patient described it as if having barbed wire in his joints. So it's a recessive gene, which means that I'm a carrier, my wife's a carrier. We don't actually have it because we also have a good copy of the gene. And there is a 1 in 4 chance that each child will get the bad copy from both parents. And so it's rather unfortunate that both the children have actually got, the malfunctioning AKU gene. Yeah.
Right, so you have this minor, so make sure I understand right, you have this basically a buildup of this, it's an acid effectively, and then over time it causes all sorts of problems throughout the body. So just to take us back to you founded the AKU Society with a few of your colleagues, and you started to think immediately about a cure, or what was the goal there?
So we wanted to work on a cure or a treatment. We were told at the time that there was a potential drug being developed, but that it wouldn't be ready for years. And so again, I kind of asked around, searched a bit, and came across a researcher in the US at the National Institutes of Health, which is the big, kind of federal research agency in the US just outside Washington. And the doctor, it was called Dr. Bill Gall, and he was studying a drug called nitisinone, which has had quite a surprising history, because nitisinone was originally developed as a weed killer in the 80s by a huge conglomerate called ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, or something along the lines. And the way it was developed as a weed killer was that there was a scientist at ICI who noticed in his garden that he had a plant called the Australian bottlebrush plant. And around that plant there were no weeds, and he thought that's surprising. And so he analysed the plant, and he managed to isolate the substance and synthesised it as nitisinone as a weed killer. Unfortunately, it didn't work very well as a weed killer, because it tended, I believe, to kill the plants as well as the weeds, so not really commercialisable. However, an analogue of nitisinone, mesotrione, is one of the most sold weed killers in the world, and you can buy it at your local gardening store. So anyway, and he also found that nitisinone worked on the tyrosine metabolic pathway. So tyrosine is an amino acid, it's one of the building blocks of protein, and when it gets broken down in the body, that's when there's a certain step and an enzyme missing and the homogentic acid builds up. But what nitisinone does is that it basically blocks the breakdown of tyrosine in plants. Okay.
Right.
And so he thought if it does that in plants, it should probably work in the same way in humans, because humans also break down tyrosine. And so then he thought there is this rare disease called hereditary tyrosinemia type 1, which is a very nasty rare disease that kills children by age 2, which is just one step down from AKU. And he thought maybe nitisinone can actually treat tyrosinemia type 1. So he got in touch with some researchers in Sweden, and they had these little babies with tyrosinemia type 1 who were going to die. They basically would die of liver cancer by age 2. And they literally mixed up the weed killer in a bowl and fed it to these children. And the children lived and thrived. So it's a miracle weed killer, basically, with very few side effects. Because it works on the same metabolic pathway as AKU, Dr. Bill Gall, the guy at the National Institutes of Health, thought maybe it can be used to treat AKU. So he then did some studies, and he did a study on 40 patients from 2006 to 2008 or 9, 20 on the drug, 20 off the drug, but that failed. And because they couldn't prove that it worked, even though the patients were raving about it. And so what we did, because we believe the drug does work, we've proven in an animal model, a mouse model of the disease, that it works incredibly well. We believe that it was a problem with the design of their clinical trial. So in the US, they hadn't recruited enough patients.
Only 20 people, you said.
20 on, 20 off. It didn't last long enough, only 3 years, and they only looked at one evaluation criteria, which was hip rotation. And obviously, the disease affects people very differently. Some it's the hips, some it's the spine, elbows, whatever. So they proved nothing. And that's why we then raised some funds. We raised overall 11 million euros to do a series of clinical trials on a much larger scale. And that's what we're working on now.
Talk me through some of those conversations with the funders. Did you often hear from them, you already had this trial in the US that failed, you're wasting your time, or did they understand the way you all did that you needed more data or you needed more time to do it right?
That's right, yes. I mean, the difficulty was not so much with the funders, but with the company that owns the drug. Because after the US trial failed, they said, look, this is just too difficult.
Right.
To do a large study on such an ultra-rare disease will be costly, and that they thought they would not make their money back. They're a business, that's how they operate. But what we had done with the AKU Society, the patient group, and with Professor Ranganath and another professor called Professor Jim Gallagher in Liverpool, is we put all the building blocks in place to be able to do a much more effective and sophisticated trial. So we developed, as I said, an animal model of the disease from which we raised £500,000 from the big lottery fund to do that animal model. And when we fed the mice the drug at birth, they didn't develop any symptoms of AKU. And if we fed it halfway through life, it completely stopped the evolution of the disease. And we also funded what's called a natural history study, which is where you study patients but without giving them a drug. And this allowed Professor Ranganath to develop what is called a severity score index, which measures the impact of the disease on all the different parts of the body. And you can then make a score out of that, and you can then re-measure every year, and you can see whether the score's going up or whether it's stable or whatever. And that's how you can track the evolution of the disease.
Right, so rather than just a single thing, I think you mentioned hip rotation, you can get a really comprehensive picture of how is this potential treatment affecting every patient individually.
That's absolutely right. And once we had all those building blocks in place, we went back to see the company and they said, yeah, we think there's a chance it might work. And they got on board and provided some of the funding towards the 11 million euros. And so we've now finished. So it was a 7-year program. We got 6 million of those euros came from the European Commission, because the EU can think on a continent-wide scale when it comes to rare diseases, and can provide the level of financing that national governments just don't. And it was a 7-year program, and first of all we did what's called a dose-finding study on 40 patients, and that was to find what dose would be best to use. And then that dose, 10 milligrams of the drug nitisinone, was then used in a 5-year, much larger study, what's called a phase 3 efficacy study, on 138 patients, half on the drug, half off the drug, and using that severity score index. And that all officially finished in January this year. So now the data is being analysed, and we should know in a few months' time, at least we'll be able to tell publicly whether it was successful or not.
Right, so I think you said a couple months away from knowing the results. How do you feel? I mean, you've done a decade of work leading up to this. Do you feel excited? Are you nervous? A little bit of both?
I'm very nervous. I believe that the drug works. The patients were really saying it was changing their lives. And in the UK, people have been also able to access the drug in what's called an off-label manner by going to the National AKU Centre that we set up at Liverpool Hospital. And the data from that shows that the drugs work.
Right.
Shows that the drug works, sorry. But proving that in a large, randomised, European-wide trial is potentially more difficult.
Right.
So I believe it works. I'm very optimistic about the results. But as with all medical research, you never know until you've seen the data, because there might be something that we just haven't thought of.
And if it does go through, though, this means not just patients in the UK can get access through the study at Liverpool, but it should be available across the European Union. Is that right?
That's right. So if the study is positive, the company will then hopefully apply to the European Medicines Agency for what's called a marketing authorization, which is a license to sell the drug. And the European Medicines Agency will then look at the data for, I think, at least a year, kind of go over all the data and ask, really stringent questions and everything. And then if it approves it, the company will then be able to sell it across Europe, but first will have to get approval from the reimbursement agencies in each country that they will reimburse it. So it's still a while. And that just showed me how long the development process for drugs, how long it actually is, because it's very linear. You can't do your efficacy trial before you've done your dose trial. You can't do your dose trial before having tested in healthy volunteers. You can't do that before having tested in animals. It's one thing after the next, and so it's very linear, which is why drug development takes so long.
So for people who might be listening to this who either themselves have a rare condition or maybe one of their family members do, what were you expecting at the beginning of this that has been different? Would you offer any advice to them on how, if they want to do something like this, what they have in store?
Well, first of all, to be tenacious and patient. Tenacious because this is a lifelong journey. I remember meeting somebody from Eurodis, the European Organisation of Rare Diseases, a few years ago, and she said the fight never stops. Even once your drug has been authorised, even when patients are having it, you still need to keep on campaigning and advocating for your patients and all that, because things can still go the other way. So you need a lot of tenacity and a lot of patience, because this is a long game. You don't develop a new drug in a couple of years. You need at least a decade.
So while all this was happening, you also founded another organization called Findacure, which I think is an incredible organization. I think it'd be great if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about that and what led you to start Findacure.
Sure. I was regularly being contacted by parents of children with rare diseases, with other rare diseases, for whom there was no patient group. And they would say, my child's just been diagnosed with this rare disease, I've heard of what you've done with AKU, what do I need to do to set up my own patient group and really advocate for my children? And so rather than just answer in a piecemeal fashion to one group this week, another group next week, I decided to set up a new charity called Findacure, which would help all these early stage patient groups. So what Findacure does is provide training to patient groups, particularly to what I call kitchen table patient groups.
Right.
Mum and dad round the kitchen table, kind of wondering what to do. And so at Findacure we do a number of things to train them. We do workshops on all kinds of issues, some on how to fundraise, how to do a clinical trial, how to set up a scientific advisory board, how to work with industry. Because what I realised was that all the challenges we face are actually quite similar with other rare diseases. The diseases are very different in themselves. AKU is very different to a disease like Alström syndrome or progeria or whatever. Very different in the symptoms and all that. But the challenges you face as a patient group are the same. It's lack of knowledge, lack of scientific research, difficulty access funding, marginalisation, isolation, and that's why these drugs are called, and these diseases are called orphan diseases, because they're orphaned from society, orphaned from the medical profession, and kind of orphaned from politics and everything, really. So I set up Findacure, and we really found that there was a lot of need. So another thing we actually do through Findacure is what's called a peer mentoring scheme, and this is when more established patient groups or experts in, say, the media or whatever are buddied up with mentees who might be some of these new patient groups that are setting up for a whole year, and they provide them with advice and with guidance and all that, and what they need to do. So for instance, last year I was mentoring a group called Annabelle's Challenge, which works on vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a really nasty disease where veins and arteries can just spontaneously rupture. And the guy I was mentoring, Jared, absolutely incredible, really entrepreneurial, has just gone on in leaps and strides and all that. And now he is mentoring another group himself this year. So the idea is really to kind of build this network. And what also Findacure does is work on what we call drug repurposing or repositioning, which is kind of what we did with AKU. So when you reposition a drug, you basically take a drug that's used for one disease and you prove it can be used for another disease, because most drugs have a variety of effects on the body. So we showed, we've been showing that the drug which is used for tyrosinemia type 1 can be used for AKU. That is repositioning. And the reason it's good is that it means you don't have to do all the stuff like toxicology and all that kind of stuff that you have with a new drug, because it's already known from its use in the other disease. And if you just look at very common drugs like propranolol, which is a beta blocker, which is very widely used for heart problems. It's also used for migraines. It's got potential for post-traumatic stress disorder, for social anxiety, for all kinds of other disorders, and that's fantastic. And so that's what we've been really campaigning for at Findacure, is the repositioning of drugs for rare diseases.
Right, and it seems to me like an incredibly cost-effective way to do it, because you've presumably already proved that it's safe in people, because if it's being prescribed for one condition, you understand the side effects, and so then can you jump straight to the second phase of clinical trials where you're actually testing if it works or if it doesn't?
That's right, yes. I mean, I suppose the difficulty that you get with most drug repositioning is that those drugs have gone off patent. So when a drug company develops a drug, they put a patent on it, and that means they can then have exclusivity to sell it for a number of years and make their money back. And at the end of the patent, it becomes what's called generic, which means that other companies can produce it, and the cost just plummets. So no company then has an incentive to develop it again for another disease, and that's why you have to think of quite innovative funding models, such as the idea of a social impact bond, which the CEO of Findacure, Rick Thompson, has been looking into, to manage to develop them. So that's the complication. It's a case of market failure, fundamentally.
Right. You have conditions that collectively affect a huge fraction of the population, right? It's probably 1 in 20 or 1 in 15 people that have a rare condition, but each one itself is so rare that no one is, I guess, financially incentivized to develop treatments for it. Is that an accurate way of putting it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, that is the problem. And one of the reasons things have changed, but not so much for drug repositioning, but for just drug development for rare diseases, is that the US passed a law in 1984 called the Orphan Drug Act, and the European Commission passed a law in 2000, also an Orphan Drug Act, which gives incentives for industry to develop drugs for rare diseases. So, for instance, even if their patent runs out, once they get marketing authorization, they then get a number of years, like up to 10 or 11 years of exclusivity, depending on the country, where only they can sell it, and it allows them to make their money back. But that doesn't really work necessarily well for generic drugs.
Right, so once it's already gone off, then there's no going back.
It's more difficult to actually adhere to it.
And I guess there are also other challenges around cost, right? If it's only going to treat, in the case of AKU, you said one person in about every 500,000. So in the whole country here, maybe 100 or 150 people.
Maximum.
Right.
So we know, I think, of 95 in the UK. So there's probably more out there, but I suppose AKU has the advantage of the urine going black, so a lot of our patients get diagnosed at birth, although not that many overall. About a third get diagnosed at birth, and some get diagnosed much later in life, and some about halfway through life when they start to develop really bad symptoms. And the reason is that when the kids are born and their urine goes black, sometimes the doctor just said there's nothing to worry about, your child is fine, so the parents stop thinking about it. Other times they get a diagnosis but they don't tell the child. There's all kinds of reasons why often children don't know, that they have the illness. And even when they get to adulthood, we had one patient who went for a joint replacement, and the surgeon opened up and saw it was all black and changed the joint, but didn't tell the patient, which is just shocking. And the patient only found out on their second joint replacement when the surgeon
the new surgeon went in and saw what was happening.
So it's difficult.
Right. So I guess Findacure and other organizations like that can help bring people up to speed in the way that you suggested earlier. Everybody doesn't have to reinvent the wheel or learn these things kind of fresh themselves.
Yeah.
Great. So I know we're running out of time here. I just thought I'd kind of recap and explain why I think your story is remarkable. I think for really two reasons. First is that I think it shows what can be accomplished from a group of very dedicated people. I think you said earlier you have to be tenacious and patient, and I think that the amount of time it's taken and also the probably incredible number of challenges you faced along the way, I think is really remarkable. And then second, I think is how important it is to bring different groups to the table. So it's, individual patient advocates, patient groups, but also the companies, the funding groups like the European Commission, the NHS, who's going to ultimately deliver this in the UK. So it seems to me like actually orchestrating all of these different groups that have quite different roles to play, but somehow people like you getting them and Dr. Ranganath getting them kind of aligned in the right direction is pretty remarkable. So I think it's just amazing to think about how we could replicate this and how we could find other people out there like yourself and these other groups to take things that might have market failures and actually make something amazing out of it. So hopefully you hear good news within a month, yes. 2 months. We'll definitely keep everybody updated on the story. So thanks everyone for listening. As always, you can send us any feedback, any questions you have to podcast@sanogenetics.com. We do read and respond to every email. If you like the podcast, we'd love it if you could share it with a friend or leave us a review on iTunes to help other people find it. And then finally, feel free to visit our website, sanogenetics.com, to learn more about some of the research projects we're running and other topics through our blog. We'd like to say thank you very much, Nick. Could you let people know where they can find you or more information about what you're doing, whether it's Twitter, your website, anything like that?
Sure. So 2 websites, one for the AKU Society, which is www.akusociety.org. And then for Findacure, it's www.findacure.org.uk.
Great, wonderful. Thanks again, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.